The message arrived like any other notification, but the words froze me in place. Stay away this year. We need space. I read it again, waiting for the meaning to change, for the letters to rearrange themselves into something less cruel. But they didn't. They stayed fixed, cold, and final. 15 years of showing up, of holding a family together in ways no one ever acknowledged, collapsed into that single rejection. I was standing in my farmhouse kitchen, chopping apples for a pie I had planned to bring to Thanksgiving. The knife was still in my hand when my stomach dropped. I had been building the holiday in my head for weeks. What I would cook, how I would decorate, the drive home that had become routine. Now it was gone. With one message, my place at the table had been erased. For a moment my body reacted before my mind could. My hands trembled so hard I had to put the knife down. The sound of it clattering against the cutting board echoed too loudly in the room. My chest felt tight, the kind of ache that travels up your throat and makes it hard to breathe. I kept staring at the phone, hoping for another text to explain it, to soften it, but nothing came. I dialed my mother anyway. When she answered, her voice carried that practiced cheerfulness I had learned to recognize as a cover. "Abby dear, how are you?" "Mom," I said, my voice cracking. "What is going on?" "I just got your text." There was a pause, and then her tone shifted into something rehearsed. "We just thought it might be best to keep things simpler this year. A smaller gathering. Nothing to worry about." "Smaller," I repeated. "So who's coming?" "Just David and Pamela. And little Thomas, of course. You know how much joy he brings." It landed like a second blow. Everyone was welcome except me. "So it's not smaller," I whispered. "It's just without me." "Don't make this something it isn't," she said quickly. "We just thought you'd enjoy the break. You've been so busy and the drive is long." I felt heat rise in my face. Did I do something wrong? "No, darling, of course not. We just need space. That's all." Before I could answer, my father's voice came on the line. He must have been listening. "Abby, it's just one Thanksgiving. Don't make a big deal out of it. We'll see you at Christmas." It was the dismissal in his tone that stung most. Like my pain was an inconvenience, like the years I'd sacrificed to be the dependable daughter were nothing more than background noise. I ended the call with a shaky promise to think about it, though there was nothing to think about. They had already made their choice. Afterward I sat on the kitchen floor. The cold tile pressed through my jeans as tears came harder than I expected. I hadn't cried like that in years, not even in moments when life had felt impossible. This was different. This wasn't about missing a holiday. It was about realizing I could give everything and still be considered disposable. I thought about all the times I had driven 3 hours each way for Sunday dinners, even after exhausting shifts. About the daily calls, the birthday cakes, the holidays where I had done most of the cooking while my parents took the credit. I thought about how I had made their approval the compass of my life, bending myself to fit their image of what I should be. And still, somehow, it wasn't enough. The grief was heavy. It sat on me like weight I couldn't shift. But underneath it, anger began to flicker. Quiet at first, like a spark in ashes. How dare they decide I was the one who needed to stay away? How dare they dismiss me as though I hadn't spent my whole life proving my worth? I cycled through the emotions in waves. Hurt, rage, bargaining. Maybe if I called back and promised to visit more, they'd change their minds. Maybe if I offered to cook everything, they'd let me come. But each thought ended in the same hollow truth. They didn't want me there. When the tears finally slowed, the house was dark. I pulled myself up, leaning on the counter for support. My kitchen looked different now. The same windows, the same orchard outside, but it all felt sharper, like the air itself had shifted. I realized I was standing in a space I had built with my own hands, from the money I had earned through work they once called just a hobby. This home was proof of my independence. And yet here I was, undone by a single text. I picked up the phone again, not to call them back but to reply. My fingers hovered before I typed, "Have a lovely, quiet Thanksgiving." It was the calmest mask I could manage. A sentence that sounded polite, but carried all the resignation I couldn't say aloud. When I hit send, the screen went black in my hand. I placed the phone face down on the counter, reached into the freezer and pulled out a pint of Rocky Road. The spoon scraped the frozen surface as I sat on the couch, the house quiet except for my breathing. It was a ritual of self-pity I almost hated myself for, but the sweetness numbed the sharpest edges of the ache. Halfway through the pint, my phone rang. It was Sarah, my closest friend. She didn't even let me say hello before asking, You sound awful. What happened? The story tumbled out in pieces, broken by the sound of my own voice. They don't want me there, I said finally. I've been cut out like I don't matter. Those jerks, she said bluntly. Who does that to their own daughter? Maybe they're right, I whispered. Maybe I have been pulling away. Maybe I deserve it. Stop that, Sarah's voice cut through. You've given them everything. One move, one boundary, and suddenly you're disposable? That's not normal, Abby. Her words landed differently. Like someone had cracked open a window in a room I didn't know was suffocating me. For the first time that day I felt something besides grief. Not relief. Not hope. But a shift. A thought I hadn't considered. Maybe this rejection wasn't an ending. Maybe it was the start of something else. And that was the moment I knew. This silence had split more than my holiday. It had split the life I thought I had to keep living from the one I might still be able to build. When I think back, I realize that text wasn't an isolated act. It was the conclusion of years of playing a role I never chose. I had always been the reliable daughter, the one who filled the gaps so no one else had to. My parents didn't ask directly, but they didn't need to. I knew what was expected and I delivered. I was the one who remembered every birthday, who baked the cakes, who bought the thoughtful gifts. I was the one who called every evening even when work left me drained. If there was a family dinner, I drove 3 hours each way, never arriving empty-handed. They liked to talk about family being everything, but in practice, family meant me showing up and them receiving it without question. Looking back, I see how often I was compared to my brother, David. He followed the script. Business degree, accounting job, marrying Pamela, the daughter of one of Dad's golf partners. He was safe, predictable, easy to understand. My path didn't fit that frame. I chose kitchens over boardrooms, a chef's coat over a business suit. From the start, my parents treated it as a flaw. Cooking is a hobby, Abby. Not a career, my mother once said, her lips pressed tight. I still hear the way my father sighed, the disappointment in it heavier than words. You're smart enough to do better. Those moments left marks I didn't notice until much later. I carried them like invisible weights, always trying to prove that my choices were worthy, that my success was more than an accident. Every promotion, every restaurant I worked in, every review I earned, part of me wanted to call home and say, see? I'm not a failure. I matter too. When my first cookbook came out, they displayed it proudly in their living room. But when I asked if they'd tried any of the recipes, my mother waved it off. The photographs are lovely, she said, as if I had been nothing more than a model in someone else's work. That was the pattern. They wanted the image of success, not the reality of who I was. They wanted to say, our daughter, the beautiful chef, but they didn't want to taste the food or understand the life it took to create it. For years I accepted it. I told myself that was love, their way of showing pride. And maybe a part of me feared what would happen if I ever stopped performing. The move to Vermont was the first real crack in that performance. I had saved for years, worked impossible hours, sacrificed sleep and social life, just to buy that farmhouse with its wide kitchen and orchard. To me it was a dream. To them it was distance. Vermont. That's so isolated, my mother had said. What she meant was, you'll be farther away from us, harder to control. The shift was small at first. Calls that had been daily slipped to every other day, then to twice a week. When a flood in my basement kept me from making a Sunday dinner, my mother treated it like betrayal. We always count on you, she said, the words carrying more accusation than disappointment. And then came the comparisons. David and Pamela brought Thomas over yesterday. It's wonderful having family close by. The subtext was sharp. I was no longer counted as family, at least not in the same way. David was the golden son, the one who lived nearby, who gave them their first grandchild, who made their lives easier. I had become the distant daughter, the one who chose her career and her house over them. It was subtle, but I felt it. The guilt trips, the quiet digs, the way affection was withheld when I didn't fall in line. At the time I brushed it off as stress, as me being too sensitive. But sitting there on my kitchen floor after the Thanksgiving text, the pattern was undeniable. They had trained me into compliance, into carrying the weight of responsibility, into smoothing over conflicts, into accepting less affection in exchange for approval that always felt conditional. And I had gone along with it, thinking it was love. The truth was harder to swallow. I had been convenient, youthful, easy to rely on, but not fully seen. As I let that realization sink in, I remembered something my father once said when I was promoted to executive chef. I had called to share the news, expecting, even craving, congratulations. Instead, his first response was, "Will you still have time to visit us with all those new responsibilities?" It hadn't struck me then, but now the message was clear. My achievements were only valuable if they didn't interfere with their expectations. That thought stung, but it also clarified something. Maybe the Thanksgiving exclusion wasn't about space. Maybe it wasn't about Pamela's pregnancy or a smaller gathering. Maybe it was a punishment. A way of reminding me that independence came with consequences. I thought about that a lot in the days that followed. Every memory reshaped itself in the light of that possibility. Every guilt trip, every comparison, every moment where I swallowed my own needs for theirs, it all lined up like dominoes leading to this moment. It's strange how quickly clarity can shift grief. I still hurt, but I began to understand that their rejection wasn't proof that I had failed them. It was proof that I had stepped outside the role they depended on me to play. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If my worth in their eyes depended on compliance, then what would it mean to stop complying? I didn't know the answer yet. But the question itself was enough to mark a shift. It was the first quiet step toward seeing my life as mine, not theirs. At first, rejection flattened me. The silence after that call was louder than anything I had ever known. I moved through my house like a ghost, unable to shake the thought that I had been cut out of something sacred. Thanksgiving wasn't just a holiday in our family. It was tradition, a ritual I had helped carry year after year. Without it, I felt stripped of place, of belonging. For 2 days, I let the ache consume me. I stayed in pajamas, half-watched cooking shows I couldn't absorb, left dishes piled in the sink. Every time my phone lit up, I hoped it was them taking it back. But it wasn't. The space they wanted stretched wider each hour until it felt like a canyon. By the third evening, I was in my kitchen again. The room smelled faintly of apples from the pie I had never finished. I stood at the counter, staring at the flour still sitting in its tin, the measuring cups scattered as if waiting for me to pick up where I left off. Instead, I sank onto the floor, back against the cabinet, legs folded, tears slipping down without warning. I thought of all the years I had given them. The drives in snowstorms, the hours spent cooking meals no one thanked me for, the calls I made no matter how tired I was. And still I was the one excluded. The unfairness of it burned, but beneath that was something heavier, shame. A voice inside whispered that maybe they were right, maybe I had pulled too far away, maybe my independence was a mistake. That was when my phone rang. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me craved a voice that wasn't my own. "You sound terrible," she said the moment I answered. "What happened?" The story spilled out, halting at first, then rushing like a dam had broken. I told her about the text, the call, the way my parents dismissed me. When I repeated my mother's words, "We just need some space," my throat tightened. "Those jerks," Sarah said sharply. "Who does that to their own daughter?" "Maybe they're right," I whispered. "Maybe I have been pulling away. Maybe I'm the bad daughter." "Stop that," her voice cut through. "You've bent yourself backwards for them your whole life. One boundary, one move to a place that makes you happy, and suddenly you're unwanted? That isn't love, Abby. That's control." Her words landed harder than I expected. For years I had normalized the guilt, the comparisons, the way their approval came only when I met their standards. I had called it love. But hearing Sarah name it as something else, something manipulative, shook me awake. "You know what?" she added. "If they don't want you at their Thanksgiving, host your own. Do it for the people who actually value you." I laughed weakly. "A Thanksgiving for one? Very festive." "Not for one, you goose. For friends. For people who'd be grateful to sit at your table." The idea seemed absurd. I had never hosted a holiday by myself. For as long as I could remember, Thanksgiving belonged to my parents' house. The thought of stepping into that role felt impossible. But as Sarah kept talking, her voice full of conviction, her belief in me stronger than my own, a spark flickered. I looked around my kitchen. The wide counters, the big farmhouse sink, the dining room just beyond with its bare wooden table. I had bought this house with dreams of hosting, of filling it with food and laughter. What was stopping me now? For the first time since that text, the ache in my chest loosened. I could almost see it. Friends gathered around mismatched chairs, dishes spread across the table, the air thick with warmth instead of judgment. "Think about it," Sarah urged. "You're literally a professional chef. You have the space, the skill, the heart. You could create something amazing. And instead of walking on eggshells all day, you'd be surrounded by people who actually appreciate you. After we hung up, I stood at the counter again. This time I didn't sink to the floor. I pulled out a notebook and began to write. A list of names. Miguel, my old sous chef who had just moved to Burlington. Jasmine and Tyler, the couple from the farmer's market. Frank, my widowed neighbor who always brought me jars of jam. Colleagues from New Hampshire, friends from culinary school. Before I could second-guess myself, I drafted a message. Hosting a Friendsgiving at my place this year. Good food, good company, no drama. Let me know if you'd like to join. I hit send to 15 people, expecting maybe a handful of polite declines. But replies came almost immediately. Miguel, count me in. Thank God, an excuse to skip a shift. Jasmine and Tyler. We'll bring wine from our vineyard. Frank called, voice cracking with emotion as he accepted. By the next morning, 12 people had confirmed. More followed. The spark became a flame. I began planning with the precision of a chef and the hunger of someone reclaiming joy. Turkey brined in cider, maple roasted vegetables, cornbread stuffing with local sausage. Rolls from scratch, pies from my orchard apples. I found a long farm table at an antique store, hauled it home and scrubbed it clean until it gleamed. Every decision was mine alone, free from criticism, free from rules I never agreed to. As the days ticked closer, grief gave way to anticipation. The holiday I had thought would leave me empty was becoming something else entirely. Something that belonged to me. Standing in that same kitchen where I had once cried, I realized something profound. I didn't need permission to belong. I didn't need their approval to celebrate. For the first time in years, the holiday wasn't about them. It was about me, and the people who wanted to be here not out of obligation but out of choice. And that realization was the true turning point. The week leading up to Thanksgiving felt different from every year before it. Instead of packing a bag for Connecticut and rehearsing small talk for my parents' dining room, I was clearing space in my own home, preparing to host people who had chosen to spend the holiday with me. Each task, scrubbing the farmhouse table, stringing lights along the porch, stacking logs by the fireplace, felt like reclaiming something I hadn't realized I'd lost. What started as an act of defiance became an act of creation. The guest list kept growing. By Tuesday I had 22 confirmations, more than I'd ever imagined. Miguel offered to bring extra kitchen equipment from his restaurant. Jasmine and Tyler promised wine, candles, and gourds for the table. My neighbor Frank said he'd bake rolls and bring old photos of Thanksgivings with his late wife. Each message carried the same unspoken thread. We want to be there with you. Sarah arrived that Tuesday evening with an overnight bag and a smile that made my kitchen feel lighter. Together we worked like we used to in college. Music playing, wine glasses half full, hands busy chopping and stirring. Tell me honestly, she said, crimping the edge of a pie crust. Are you still upset with them? I stirred cranberry sauce slowly, thinking. Yes and no. I'm hurt. I don't know if that will ever go away. But I'm also grateful in a strange way. Without them pushing me out, I don't think I would have done this. Sarah smiled softly. Their loss. Wait until they see what they missed. By Wednesday the house began to fill. Miguel showed up with his boyfriend Luis, lugging pans and a blender the size of a small engine. Jasmine and Tyler arrived with baskets of candles and pumpkins, transforming my dining room into something that looked like the pages of a magazine. Frank carried in his rolls, his hands shaking slightly but his smile wide. Haven't had a full table since my wife passed, he said quietly. Thank you for letting me be part of this. As more people arrived, something clicked. My house was alive in a way it had never been. The kitchen buzzed with chopping and laughter. The smell of garlic and rosemary mingled with maple and cinnamon. Conversations overlapped, strangers finding common ground. There was no tension, no sharp glances, no eggshells underfoot. Just warmth. That night my Aunt Catherine called. Her voice was familiar comfort. Abby darling, how are you? I'm good, I said, looking around at the chaos in my kitchen. Actually, better than I thought I'd be. She hesitated. Your mother mentioned you wouldn't be at Thanksgiving. She said it was your choice. Something about work keeping you too busy. The lie hit me harder than I expected. For a moment I couldn't speak. That's not exactly how it happened, I said finally and told her everything. The text, the call, the exclusion, and the Friendsgiving I was creating instead. She sighed deeply. I suspected as much. Your mother has always been controlling, but this is cruel. To uninvite her own daughter? And then lie about it? That's beyond her usual. I swallowed hard. I don't want you caught in the middle. Abby, she said firmly, I'd rather sit at your table than hers. Do you have room for one more? The words lodged in my throat. For years I had felt like the expendable one the daughter left out. And now here was family choosing me. We'd love to have you, I whispered. Good. I'll tell your mother I'm sick. She'll never argue with that. Text me your address. When I hung up, I leaned against the porch railing, tears pricking my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like the one left behind. Thanksgiving morning dawned cold and clear. I rose before the sun, slipped into slippers and padded to the kitchen. The turkey came out of its brine, patted dry and rubbed with butter and herbs. The familiar rhythm of cooking steadied me, but this time it wasn't performance. It was joy. By the time Sarah stumbled downstairs, the house already smelled of sage and roasting vegetables. Guests began arriving before noon. Frank carried old black and white photos of holiday tables from decades past, setting them gently on a side table. For atmosphere, he said with a wink. Jasmine and Tyler brought not only their promised wine but 2 new friends who carried a wild rice dish. Colleagues from the restaurant arrived with pies and stories from morning shifts. My dining room stretched with extra leaves, mismatched chairs, and even hay bales covered with quilts to fit everyone. By early afternoon my house hummed with voices, laughter spilling into every corner. Aunt Catherine arrived last, arms full of flowers and a bottle of bourbon. She hugged me tight. This, she whispered, looking around the crowded room, is what family should feel like. At 2 o'clock I rang a small bell. Conversations hushed and everyone found a seat or a place to stand. I looked out at faces, some old, some new, and felt a swell of gratitude that nearly overwhelmed me. Before we eat, I began, my voice catching, I just want to thank you all. A month ago I thought I'd be spending this holiday alone. Instead I'm surrounded by people who chose to be here. Not out of obligation but out of love. I can't tell you what that means to me. Catherine raised her glass. To chosen family. To chosen family, the group echoed, glasses lifting, eyes bright. As dishes began to pass, turkey, stuffing, roasted vegetables, I realized something I had never understood at my parents' table. Belonging isn't about duty. It isn't about meeting expectations or keeping appearances. Belonging is about being wanted as you are. And sitting there, surrounded by warmth that had nothing to do with bloodlines, I finally felt what it meant to belong. The morning after Friendsgiving, I woke to silence broken only by the faint creak of the house. The kitchen was cluttered with empty bottles, stacked plates, and the remains of a feast. My friends still slept in guest rooms and on couches, their laughter from the night before lingering like warmth in the air. For once I felt whole. I poured coffee and reached for my phone, expecting nothing more than stray thank yous from guests. Instead, the screen lit with 37 texts and 12 missed calls. My chest tightened. The first messages were from acquaintances. Your table looked beautiful, that turkey was unreal. But further down the tone shifted, frantic texts from my brother followed by my mother's sharp words. We need to talk now. Call me the minute you get this. I stared at the phone. Somehow they had seen. Miguel wandered in, hair rumpled, pouring himself coffee. Everything okay? They know, I whispered, showing him the screen. He frowned. Supposed to be a secret? Not exactly. I just didn't tell them. Before he could answer, the phone buzzed again. My mother's ringtone. I hesitated. Sarah, now awake, caught my eye. You don't have to answer, she said softly. But I knew I did. I pressed speaker. Abigail Jean Martin. My mother's voice cracked with fury. Would you care to explain the photos I'm looking at right now? You told us you were fine with a quiet Thanksgiving. And now I see this circus? 20 people in your house. Catherine drinking bourbon on your porch? Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? I gripped the counter, willing my voice not to shake. I never said I'd be alone. I only said, have a lovely quiet Thanksgiving. Which I hope you did. Don't play word games with me, she snapped. You deceived us. You excluded us. You've embarrassed this family. Something inside me steadied. For years I would have apologized, begged, tried to soothe her anger. But I thought of the night before, Frank's quiet gratitude, Jasmine's laughter, Catherine's toast. I wasn't ashamed. You told me not to come, I said calmly. Your exact words were that you needed space. So I respected that. I found another way to celebrate. That's not deception. That's survival. There was a long pause. Then my father's voice, low and disapproving, joined in. Abby, what were you thinking? Several of our friends saw those photos. They're calling, asking why we weren't there. Do you have any idea how this makes us look? I almost laughed at the absurdity. This isn't about how you look. This is about how you treated me. You uninvited me from Thanksgiving. I chose not to sit alone. That's all. It's not that simple, he pressed. If you wanted to host such an elaborate event, you could have invited us. I felt heat rise in my chest. Let me understand. You told me to stay away. And now you're angry I didn't invite you back in? That makes no sense. Watch your tone, my father warned, his voice clipped. For once I didn't back down. What tone would you like? The one where I pretend it didn't hurt when you erased me from a family holiday? The one where I apologize for your choices? I've been using that tone for years. I'm done with it. The line went silent. My friends in the kitchen froze, listening. When my father finally spoke, his voice was cold. Perhaps we do need space. Perhaps we do, I answered. And I meant it. I ended the call. The kitchen stayed quiet for a long beat before Sarah reached for my hand. I'm proud of you, she said. Later that day my brother called. His voice was heavy with frustration. Couldn't you have just gone along with it for 1 year? You know how they are. Now they'll be impossible for months. I swallowed the familiar guilt, but it didn't settle like before. Why should I be the one to keep accommodating? Why didn't you say anything when they excluded me? His silence told me everything. He had always been the favored one. He wasn't about to risk that. When the call ended, I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the echoes of the night before. I thought of Catherine choosing me over them, of Miguel and Sarah standing at my side, of the laughter that had filled these rooms. For once, their anger didn't crush me. Instead, I felt something I had never felt in all my years of compliance. Freedom. The days after that confrontation were quiet, almost unnervingly so. For years, my phone had been a constant thread tying me to my parents. Calls about errands, reminders of dinners, questions about when I was coming home. Now the silence stretched. At first, I checked my notifications obsessively, half expecting more anger. But nothing came. Instead, what filtered in were messages from others. An aunt I barely spoke to writing, "Good for you for standing your ground." A family friend who had seen the photos. "That table looked beautiful. You deserved that happiness." It was strange, realizing the patterns I had endured were visible to outsiders. That what I thought was my private shame had always been quietly observed. Still, doubt crept in at night. Was I now the bad daughter? Was the silence a punishment too heavy to bear? On one of those nights, I made a choice I hadn't before. I found a therapist in town, someone who specialized in family dynamics. Sitting in her office, I spilled the story from beginning to end. The text, the exclusion, the years of guilt and compliance. When I finished, she leaned back gently. "What you're describing sounds like a family system that required you to play a specific role. The reliable one, the accommodating one. When you stepped out of that role, they reacted by excluding you. Not because you did wrong, but because the system couldn't tolerate the change." Her words landed like clarity. It wasn't about a smaller Thanksgiving. It wasn't even about me moving away. It was about control. And maybe for the first time, I hadn't let myself be controlled. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived in the mail. My father's handwriting. Inside, a letter, formal, careful, but different from his usual tone. "I don't agree with how you handled things, but I can see we may have hurt you with our request. That was not our intention. I miss our Sunday calls. Perhaps we could meet for coffee." It wasn't an apology, not fully. But it was something. A crack in the wall. I agreed, and we met at a cafe halfway between Vermont and Connecticut. The conversation was stilted, careful. But when he admitted, almost under his breath, "We took you for granted, Abby. You were always so reliable, we assumed you'd bend," I realized he understood more than he'd ever say outright. Progress with my mother came slower. When she finally called, she spoke as though nothing had happened, sliding into gossip about neighbors and updates on David's kids. When I brought up Thanksgiving, she went quiet, defensive. "I don't see why we're still discussing this. It was one holiday." "It's not about the holiday," I told her. "It's about respect. About feeling valued." There was a long pause. Then, almost a whisper, I've never been good at this. Your father says I need to listen more. That was as close to acknowledgement as she could give. And for once I didn't push further. Christmas came with a fragile truce. I joined their home on Christmas Eve bringing desserts. The old patterns lingered. Subtle comparisons, quiet disapproval, but they didn't crush me. The next day they drove up to Vermont for the first time. Seeing them in my space, my kitchen, my orchard, my dining table, shifted something. My mother ran her hands over the counters, murmuring, "It's beautiful." My father studied the apple trees with surprising interest. For the first time they saw my life on my terms. Over dinner that night my mother raised her glass. "To new traditions," she said, meeting my eyes with an honesty I hadn't expected. "And to a daughter who found her own path." The months that followed weren't perfect. Old habits reappeared, small manipulations resurfaced. But I had changed. I no longer bent out of fear of being cast aside. I held my boundaries calmly, steadily. And slowly they adjusted. When the next November approached, I made the call first. "What if we alternate?" I suggested. "This year at your house, next year at mine. Everyone included." There was a pause on the line before my mother answered softly, "I think that would be lovely." That Thanksgiving I sat at their table again. But Sarah was there too, and Aunt Catherine, both welcomed without resistance. It wasn't seamless, but it was honest. And the following year, when they came to my farmhouse and sat among friends and neighbors, I watched my mother laugh with Miguel over recipes, my father talk heritage apples with Frank. In that moment it felt like something had healed, not perfectly but enough. Looking back now I see it clearly. The rejection that split me open also gave me freedom. It forced me to stop confusing compliance with love, silence with peace, duty with belonging. It showed me that family, whether given or chosen, must be built on respect, not control. That first Friendsgiving will always stay with me. Not because of the food, though the turkey was perfect, but because it marked the moment I stopped waiting for permission to belong. I belonged already.